The idea of the national divorce is dangerous and foolhardy, and I shall explain why over the course of this video. So, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia, recently made a tweet that set off the internet, particularly the political internet, in which she said the following, quote, "We need a national divorce. We need to separate by red states and blue states and shrink the federal government. Everyone I talk to says this. From the sick and disgusting woke culture issues shoved down our throats to the Democrats' traitorous America Last policies, we are done." With the big X. And then, of course, she went on Fox News to explain what she meant by this, and just so I am not accused of strawmanning her argument, or the argument of anyone else who I'm about to address in this video, I shall put this clip in the video for you guys to watch. Go.
In my life, in my world, all of my friends are regular Americans. Everyone I talk to is sick and tired and fed up of being bullied by the left, abused by the left, and disrespected by the left. And our ideas, our policies, our ways of life have become so far apart that it's just coming to that point. And the last thing I ever want to see in America is a civil war. No one wants that. At least everyone I know would never want that. But it's going that direction, and we have to do something about it. We're also a nation, a crumbling nation. We're a nation in distress. Our government is in complete failure, over $34 trillion. We are on the verge of default, and we have to do something about that. But that was the right and the left that did that to the American people on their own. But the Democrats never stopped pushing their policies, their ideas, and their culture on Republicans and the right. And we are so sick and tired of it. We are tired of our children being taught ideas and ideologies in school that we do not want our children taught, like gender lies. We do not want our children having their gender changed or transitioned. We can't even have women's sports and privacy in our bathrooms, and women in prison can't even have spaces. ESG, environmental social governance, has completely taken over corporations, and this is a huge policy pressed on private businesses through the government from Democrats. If you're a white male today in the financial industry, you can forget it. You're a dinosaur. You're going extinct. No one should ever be hired by their skin color or their gender or
Marjorie,
how they identify. It should only be about your character and your ability to do the job.
Well, this has caused a firestorm throughout the political universe, and of course this has caused people to condemn Marjorie Taylor Greene as a traitor, and this has caused others to praise her. Now, first of all, I don't believe she is a traitor. I believe that she is sorely misguided, but a traitor she is not. A part of the American ethos is the ability to have different opinions on our political structure and to have those opinions and to exist peacefully within a society of differently minded people. But I responded to a tweet by Clint Russell, who is the host of the Liberty Lockdown podcast, and the tweet that I responded to said the following. Sure, the Department of Education wants to indoctrinate your children into radical sexual ideologies as young as possible via CRT and DEI. Sure, the FBI is irreparably corrupt. Sure, they are escalating towards World War III with 2 nuclear powers simultaneously. But national divorce is a dangerous idea, LOL. Obviously, Mr. Russell is critiquing the idea that people against national divorce are saying that it is dangerous. Now, I responded to this by saying that national divorce is a sort of cop-out, a sort of coward's move, to which I received a flood of vitriol and hate towards me, not from Mr. Russell, but from a lot of his followers, saying that I'm an idiot, saying that I want to keep America into an abusive relationship, saying that I don't understand the principle of free association, which I will talk about in this video, saying a bunch of unfounded things. And at first I was just perplexed, because my bona fides as a constitutional conservative, the character of which is fundamentally classical liberal, the character of which is also libertarian adjacent, are well established. I have been agitating towards the principle of individual liberty in our society and individualism for a very long time. So I was also accused of being on the left for having this take. I think that American political conversation has a serious problem with using the association fallacy to demean people who don't fit into the boxes certain folks rather than have, which is a serious issue. So I figured I would articulate my objections, 3 of which I have. 3 objections to the idea of national divorce, to sort of expand the scope of my argument as it relates to it. Now, I'm going to particularly respond to Marjorie Taylor Greene's comments because I believe that her comments are a good representation of what people who want national divorce believe. But also, her comments are not just her comments. This has been a conversation that's been happening for the past few years, actually for quite a while, and people like David Reboy, who is a writer over at the Claremont Institute, so a more academic voice, basically said the same thing in an article that he wrote for Substack, and he also said that critics of national divorce fail to make the moral Lincoln-esque arguments, and instead they default to practicality as a matter of attacking and defeating the proposition of national divorce. Well, I will not do the same thing. I will make both practical arguments and philosophical arguments as to why I believe national divorce is a foolhardy idea and an aim that no rational person and no American should undertake. Now, the three arguments are as follows. I'll begin with number one. National divorce, and this is the problem, is a big category mistake. National divorce, as it has been articulated, is a political solution to a cultural problem. Notice, Marjorie Taylor Greene mentioned a cultural issue in her justification of national divorce. Mr. Russell mentioned a cultural issue in his justification of national divorce. David Reboy mentions cultural issues in his justification of national divorce. The problem with this is, as the American tradition has established, and going all the way back hundreds of years, there is a distinct separation, or at least there should be, a distinct separation between the culture and politics. There is a famous quote oftentimes articulated by Andrew Breitbart that says that politics is downstream of culture. This is a little bit vague. I would even say that politics is a product and ultimately a reflection of culture, of the cultural sentiments of the governed. That is what fundamentally politics is. You don't have politics without having a preceding culture, because politics does not come out of a vacuum. It is produced by something. And in the classical liberal tradition, there is a separation between two spheres of life, the public sphere and the private sphere. Now, this theory says that the public sphere is the sphere of government, the sphere of lawmaking, the sphere of governing, the sphere of, of public expenditure. Everything that the government does in its proper function is essentially deemed to be the public sphere. The private sphere is society, it's culture, it's everyday life, it's me making this video. And the private sphere is meant to be uninterfered with by the government. In classical liberal thought, this is the same kind of thought that our founders had about America, and it's the same kind of thought that they asserted against King George and his tyrannical impulses against the American people in 1776. Now, the problem is a few things. Number one, the public-private distinction is a little bit false on a moral level, because there is no public sphere. There is only the private sphere, and the government ideally exists within the private sphere. The sort of principle of localism and subsidiarity and popular sovereignty, which puts the people at the forefront of their government, would say this. The problem is, the government has assumed a life of its own and has erected a society of its own replete with bureaucrats, special interests, self-serving politicians, and other people who have removed themselves from the people and put themselves in the fancy corridors of power in Washington, D.C., and other places where political power accumulates. And thus, the public sphere is thought to exist. But morally, there is no public sphere. Morally, the private sphere is where the culture exists, and the public sphere, the government, is merely the use of force towards certain ends. That's all government is. It's a bunch of people getting together for a particular goal, and they execute that goal by using force. Now, what's the problem? You cannot use a political prescription which will involve force for a cultural issue, because when you use force to try to affect the culture, you are effectively eroding the culture's ability to govern itself. You are hurting the proper design of the culture. If the government for example, banned all sneakers except Jordans, what you are doing is you're trying to restrict people's ability to govern what they wear on their body, and that would lead to all kinds of things. It would lead to underground sales of different kinds of sneakers. It would lead to protest, resentment, and social dissolution. The reason that you don't use force against culture is because force and culture don't mix, because culture, as the Latin root word cultura, which was born in the 15th century, would tell us, is simply the collection of habits and norms that are cultivated by the people, and this was eventually translated to mean that culture equals cultivating good habits, and intellectual virtue, and then the practices thereof are what constitute culture. But those are undertaken voluntarily. Those are undertaken interpersonally. When I talk to a friend, when you talk to a friend, when you watch this video, no one's forcing you to. You are, as a product of your free will, voluntarily deciding to do so. So, the nature of culture and the nature of power are very different. So why in the world would you think switching the hands of power, you guys are not hearing me, why would you think switching the hands of power from a national government to a different national government of a different polity would fix the culture? It does not, because politics is a result of the culture. To fix politics, you must fix culture. This is what the great William F. Buckley Jr. did back in the 60s. He understood that communism would not be defeated, it would not be slayed like the dragon that it is, unless there was a cultural groundswell within young America. So what did he do? He helped establish the Fund for American Studies, one of the greatest dispensers of classical liberal knowledge in the American tradition. He helped establish Young Americans for Freedom, which was one of the largest youth groups, political groups on universities, which fought back against communist ideals that had infiltrated America. And eventually, all of this bubbled up into the Reagan presidency. And through the Reagan presidency, which was not perfect, a lot of the damage that had been done to America and to our government had been reversed. Culture impacts politics. Politics does not impact culture. A national divorce simply changes the hands of power from one entity to another. It does not address the underlying cultural issues. It is a category error in that it presumes that power and culture are synonymous, when in all reality, habit born of free will is the proper condition of culture, not power born of force and coercion being the proper condition of culture. That's number one. Now, number two, national divorce, as I kind of alluded to, will not fix differences. Proponents of national divorce oftentimes will tell you that we are irreconcilably different. In fact, this is what Marjorie Taylor Greene explicitly said. We are irreconcilably different, and these differences are going to cause trouble, so we should just separate. But this doesn't fix the differences. So, for example, let's use an example that proponents of national divorce tend to use. Education. Let's say there's a kid being indoctrinated by the 1619 Project, which was, according to statistics, in about 2% of schools in America. And let's say that kid was being taught that project, taught that education in a particular area. Let's say that area breaks away and forms its own country, and they ban educating children and that kind of stuff. Well, the problem becomes this. What happens with the children, with the kids, who are actually educated in different polities, in different areas? The country you just broke away from would theoretically have the ability to still educate them. You may say, well, that's not my problem. But you haven't fixed the issue. All you've done is remove yourself from being in proximity to the issue. See, proximity ethics, which is a concept that I talk about a lot on this channel, is the idea that you can render moral judgments simply by looking at what someone or what something is near. So if someone is in the presence of evil, a proximity ethicist would say, hey, this is evil, or you're evil, as opposed to actually trying to understand where the person is and understand the context thereof. You don't actually fix differences by separating. You exacerbate differences by separating, because not only are you now intellectually different or spiritually different, you have now removed yourself forcefully from the situation, and you are now politically different. And we understand that political differences, are you guys hearing me? That political differences are a source of a lot of the chaos and confusion in our society. You don't build a strong society by running away from your problems. You build a strong society by confronting your problems by the Socratic method. Now, some may say, well, Christian, the left does not want to actually do that. They only want to force their way of life, their worldview, onto the rest of us. And I would say to that very simply, why can they do that? Well, first of all, I reject the premise that all people on the left want to do that. A lot of folks do. A lot of them do. But not everybody. The left is a very broad political spectrum. And part of the political conversation that is so epistemologically fraught is that people tend to caricaturize the other side. People tend to think that the right is this single entity with a single set of characteristics, and the left is the same way, as opposed to recognizing and acknowledging the nuance that exists. There are people on the left who are more like Jimmy Dore, who are more progressive, but they still understand the value of free speech and so on and so forth. There are people on the right who are simply like Mitt Romney, who are more corporatist and, devoid of life, things like that. But, they still are on the right. And then there are people on the right like me that want a minarchist state, a state that is so small you can barely see it, as Rand Paul once said. And there are folks on the left that want a very big and towering tyrannical state like Bernie Sanders that think that the government should provide you all your needs. There are so many variations. So you have to be specific when you are giving a prognosis of a political issue. Divorce does not fix differences, whether it's in a marriage, whether it's in a political situation. And it does not actually impact anything beyond removing you from it. Now, another thing that's very interesting to mention. National divorce, in principle, is morally acceptable, but practically, it is not preferable. Now, what do I mean by this? National divorce is a consequence of the principle of the freedom of association. The principle of freedom of association says very simply that you have the ability to associate with whomever you would like, whenever you would like, so long as you are doing so in a way that is not injurious to the rights of someone else. This is a principle that America is built upon. This is a principle that I personally affirm in my own intellectual and philosophical life. And this is a principle that must be defended. Having said that, there's a very big difference of 10 people saying, we want to make our own country, than 20,000 people saying, we want to make our own country. 10 people saying that, it's a quantifiable, measurable amount that can be done in maybe a way that is not as injurious to the rights as others. But 20,000 folks saying, hey, let's take this big swath of Texas and cut it out so we can be our own country, that may prove injurious to the minority of people that live there, or in any context, who don't want that. The reason why America's government, or America's political principle, was so powerful was because it recognized the minority of one and the importance of the minority of one, the individual, and what the individual needs should always be safeguarded against what the majority dictates, particularly if the majority is trying to act in a manner that is injurious to the individual's life, health, and property. This is the basic moral axiom of America. Now, unfortunately, this basic moral axiom has not been upheld throughout history. It has been rebelled against, which is why there are a lot of folks who support national divorce who want it. But a rebellion against sound principles does not necessitate that you yourself go ahead and create a different system, especially when the system at hand is still, in theory, bound by those principles. There are ways to work in the system to produce the effect you desire. I mentioned that national divorce does not escape differences. I'll go even further than that. National divorce simply localizes your differences to a different area. Even within people who tend to agree on a baseline of things, there will be differences. You can create a new country. There will still be differences in how people view that country and how people view the fate of that country and the ideas that country should be constituted by. Within factions, there are divisions. And so, how in the world do you expect to escape all differences, even if you go to an area where most of the people are like-minded? It is not realistic, it is not practical, and frankly, it's anti-human. Human beings, by our mere existence, are dynamic creatures who are born to have a mind capable of understanding and apprehending and dealing with many different thoughts, and also a mind that produces different thoughts. The political reality should reflect the proper condition of man. It should not go against that in the name of some illusory form of unity that is alien to man's nature. Now, The history of difference within America is very important to understand. Because there are folks who say we cannot have an America with other people who have fundamentally different worldviews than what is proper. And yet, the conflict between the Anti-Federalist and the Federalist, between 1776 and 1787, which is when the Constitution was ratified, 1787, really reflects that within America there is a built-in tradition of differences. The Federalists, for example, people like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, these people largely wanted a very energetic and powerful centralized government, particularly Alexander Hamilton did. Madison was a little bit more suspicious. And so that was the Generalist Federalist project. But the Anti-Federalist, people like Patrick, Henry, they didn't want that. They wanted a political system that reflects a sort of localized view of political power, a system that allows communities to form their own rules, communities to form their own political ideas, and kept government power as close to the people as possible. Now, of course, there was a tension between these two contrasting visions. On one hand, you have centralized authority, which can overtake localism. On the other hand, you have localism, which is an antidote to centralized authority, and these two factions fought. They fought so hard that Patrick Henry, when it was all said and done, and the Bill of Rights, which is what the Anti-Federalists wanted, was incorporated into the Constitution, didn't even accept or like the Constitution in its final form. These were deep divisions. There was anger, there was conflict, there were insults. And yet, at the end of the day, the Union still worked because there was a baseline of understanding amongst the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, even if some of their other ideas were alien to each other. Now, there are some folks who will argue to me, Christian, there is no longer a baseline of understanding. But I would say, you are a victim of ideological capture. You are a victim of the sort of polarization effect born out from the media due to the fact that the media is interested in primarily promoting certain narratives. Americans, if you look at any statistic, tend to agree on baseline issues more than they don't. For example, a survey taken by Pew Research in July of 2022 found that about a majority of Americans believe that America is the greatest country on the world. The majority of Americans believe that, 52% of Americans. That same survey also found that a great majority of Americans believe that America is not as respected internationally as it had been in the past. Again, that's a baseline belief. What is America's standing in the world? Another majority of Americans believe that 68% say that the country's openness to people around the world is essential to who they are as a nation. 66%. Another majority of Americans believe that the system is not working as it should. 58%. Now, of course, surveys and all these kinds of stuff measure different kinds of people. They measure different kinds of things. They are all fundamentally different, right? There's no one survey for everything that is ironclad or bulletproof. But public opinion can test the temperatures of the current cultural sensibility. And right now, even amongst all of the division, all of the anger, there is still a good level of agreement and cohesion amongst a lot of Americans. That can't be counted off. That can't be written off. That can't be discarded because it doesn't fit our idea of what America is. The caricature of what America is in the minds of some people on the right or the left is not what real America is. Upwards of 90% of Americans are okay with interracial marriage. Upwards of 90% of Americans are okay with living and befriending people of different races. This is unity on baseline issues. And yes, there are always going to be those who don't share that baseline with you. And guess what? Karl Popper already discussed them in The Open Society and Its Enemies and already talked about how to handle them. You don't ban them. You don't attack them. You reinforce the institutions within the country, within the nation, so they can be a safeguard against those people. And if those people happen to be in the institutions, you then invade the institutions, which is kind of what DeSantis is doing, and you throw them out. You do not try to manipulate the institutions. You do not try to tyrannize your society with excess of political power. You do not try to separate yourself forcefully. You deal with the problem. Too many people don't want to deal with the problem. They don't want to actually face what's going on here. So, my friends, what is the solution? The solution is quite simple. The solution is unequivocally federalism. Federalism has been described, it was described by Lord Bryce, who was a writer and author, as a bunch of distinct buildings on the same grounds that are surrounded by a towering and larger building that stands over them, but it doesn't control them. So if that large and towering building were to go away, those distinct buildings would still be around because they are distinct, separate, and they have their own character. The problem today is that so many people don't want to actually ask the question, what is the nature of that big building? The big building being the federal government. Why has it overextended itself? And what can be done to correct it? Over the course of the past 100 years, the government has centralized so much power, it has disputed the principles of subsidiarity and localism that the Anti-Federalists advocated for, and it has destroyed, to use the metaphor, the ability of those distinct buildings to have much power and independence by connecting them with ties and ropes. This is the expansion of the federal bureaucracy, the Department of Education, the Environmental Protection Agency, all these different things that have implanted a regulatory bind on Americans, the sort of administrative state, has resulted in a lot of the chaos and confusion we now see in many areas of the country. The solution is not national divorce. The solution is the destruction of the administrative state by asserting the 10th Amendment. You don't understand. The Bill of Rights were literally built with anti-federalist sentiment. And in the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment ensures that all reserved powers, all powers that do not belong to the federal government, are therefore to be assumed by the states. That is localism. That is putting power closer to the people. That is meant to check the excesses of a centralized force. And yet, so many states, instead of actually using their authority, cave into federal authority, cave into bureaucracy, and accept it as a given, instead of exercising their power. The problem is not the system has failed us. The problem is there are so many actors in the system that refuse to acknowledge first principles, that refuse to acknowledge the moral requirements of good governance, that refuse to acknowledge the proper role of government, that refuse to acknowledge the proper corridors of power, that refuse to acknowledge all these things, and people, instead of actually trying to investigate and see why this is so, they just want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That is not a rational response. It is not a reasonable response. It is a response born of emotion. A lot of ideas people have are not actually ideas. They are placeholders for emotional significance. And the moment that those emotions are triggered, they will therefore then say the idea, like national divorce. A country not agreeing on everything is not grounds for national divorce. A system not working as it is meant to work is not grounds for national divorce. In a culture, which, by the way, there is no one American culture. There are cultural principles that are assumed by a lot of people and not by some. But a culture that is not acting the right way is not grounds for national divorce. It's grounds for people within the culture to do something with their own voluntary powers to fix it. Ignore the siren call of national divorce and embrace your own power as a free human being. So, for example, if you're angry about how your children are being educated in school, you don't like them being taught certain concepts, there's an idea that I think no one's really talked about. It's actually quite novel. It's quite interesting. If you don't like how your kid is being treated in certain schools, and you don't like your state's policies, there's one thing you can do. Move. Get out. If you don't want to move, you can homeschool. You don't want to homeschool, you can private school. There are so many different things that you as a private actor can do to affect what's happening in this country and to affect the culture that have nothing to do with politics. And yet our minds are so clouded by politics that we ignore those possibilities and we embrace the most extreme version, and that is national divorce. Reject it, embrace your free will, embrace the tools you have at your disposal, and work to fix the system, because I believe that is the only way America will survive. My friends, love you guys so much. If you love me, Patreon, be sure to donate to me, comment, like, subscribe, share. Love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.